No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy. Hello friends, Lee Seacamp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Pete Enns and Jared Byas. I love this interview. For those of you with theological interests, this interview plows a lot of ground that I spent a decade maybe or more working through myself in my seminary and grad school days. For those of you with cultural interests and all the debates around Christianity in America these days, you'll find this conversation fascinating, I think. For those of you who may just be looking for some wisdom, I think the interview is instructive as well from the simply human perspective. That is, what do you do when your own integrity and experience lead you to question some of the status quo and received wisdom, and you know it's going to cost you something? And last, Jared and Pete raised the provocative question regarding the tradition-bound and thus inescapably subjective nature of pursuits of our understanding of Scripture, or I would say the subjective nature of our understanding of most any, maybe all, our truth claims. Enjoy. Pete Enns has a PhD from Harvard University and is professor of biblical studies at Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania. He's written numerous books, including The Bible Tells Me So, The Sin of Certainty, and How the Bible Actually Works. And he hosts the Bible for Normal People podcast along with Jared Byas. Jared helps run the Bible for Normal People project, regularly writes and speaks about the Bible, truth, creativity, wisdom, and the Christian faith. He's written a handful of books, including Love Matters and Jonah for Normal People. And Jared, I understand that you are Pete's designated adult supervision.
Yeah, that's what Pete has designated me. That's part of my job. Yeah.
It's just my way of not having to do things that I don't want to do. And I exercise a lot of creative incompetence that I just screw things up all the time just to make Jared do it. So we get along great.
Yeah, I'm glad that you all have each other.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly.
Jared, are you ever able to get Pete to wear a shirt with a collar?
Rarely. I think it's only whenever he travels to other places. Only when he's not with me does he wear a collared shirt. I don't know.
That's how the world dresses. You know, I don't want to dress.
Say again,
that's how the world dresses. You know, that's how, you know.
He's trying to be in the world, but not of it.
Jesus would not wear a collared shirt. I mean, prove to me that he would.
He so quickly moved to spiritual superiority.
Yes.
I'm surprised.
Well, you know, there you go. Okay, this is the American way, I guess.
So I think the place I would like to start with the conversation today, one of my professors in graduate school one day, just as an aside, said, the person or people you choose to argue with are the most important variable in what you will do with your life in academia. And so I want to kind of begin there and ask, who are you arguing with?
Want me to go for it? I don't want to talk about it because I feel convicted about this. But, you know, I think it's true that I came out of a context I never really quite felt that I fit in, but a more conservative Calvinist context, if that means anything to all of your listeners. But, and I think I found my way through that in a great struggle, and they came out the other side, but they wound up becoming my main conversation partner in my head after I left, right? So it's true, you know, and I found exactly what you just quoted. That's absolutely true in my life. And I've worked very hard, and I think fairly successfully after maybe 5-6 years after that period ended, of saying, you know, it's a big world out there, and you're defining yourself and you're letting your opponents define your voice for you. And I said, well, I don't want to do that. That's dumb. So just be who you are and just go on with it. And every once in a while I'll engage them, but it's not with the same level of, visceral engagement as you do when you tend to react to people that you disagree with. So,
yeah. Jared, how about you?
Yeah, mine, we crossed paths and got connected in a similar scenario in more of a Calvinist tradition, but mine is definitely more flavored culturally and politically with evangelicalism and fundamentalist evangelicalism. And so that's definitely, I wouldn't say I've spent a lot of time arguing in a way that's off-putting. I have a deep love and care for people in my life, my family, my friends who I went to seminary with and went to undergrad with, and friends from my churches growing up that I have a deep affection for. And so my arguing, I hope, comes more from a place of just sharing, bearing witness to my journey and my path and my experience of the Bible and of faith, and hopefully kind of putting on them the onus of, help me understand how this logic works for you, because in my experience, the logic sort of it doubles back on itself. And so I don't understand it. But the people that I'm in conversation with or arguing with pretty consistently are more evangelical in flavor.
Now, for you, Pete, this was, I guess, personal in the sense that you lost a job due to some of the questions that you were asking. Is that correct?
More to the answers I was giving, but yeah, that's the point. Yeah, and that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. What was that process like for you in processing that kind of psychologically with regard to your sense of vocation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and there are layers to that, but I'll be brief. The school that I left was also the school that educated me, and in between that was 5 years of graduate school. And so I came to see things a little differently, but I was still committed to the tradition. So my teaching career at this particular institution lasted 14 years, and I was very much about a synthesis between critical thinking, academic thinking about the Bible, and also this particular Calvinist tradition, and finding ways of bringing those two things into conversation, which worked pretty well until towards the end when a critical mass built up at the school that didn't think that was the right way to go. And one thing I can say is that the result of that is that I'm actually pretty good, I think, at understanding where people are coming from when they disagree with me. I understand the logic. I understand the Bible passages they might go to, and I try to show them respect because I understand they're not bad people because I disagree with them. And that has helped me psychologically to just process a whole lot of things. But it was difficult. When you're sort of alone in a much bigger context and you don't quite fit anymore, but you're trying to make it fit, that was a psychological struggle for about 3 or 4 years until it just came to an inevitable end. But Lee, I mean this, I'm thankful for that period. I think I learned a lot about myself. I think I grew a lot. And I think a lot of things that have come about in my life, including things like the Bible for Normal People podcast and the things that Jared and I do together, was really born out of that experience. And it's what has led us, I mean, I can really only speak for myself here, but that's part of my motivation for bringing, the best of biblical scholarship to those who have an interest in it and saying, let's talk about other models, other paradigms, other ways of thinking about these things that are actually quite common outside of maybe the world that you might be living in. And I think that's been a help to a lot of people. I'm not sure we'd be doing this if it weren't for those experiences that I had.
Well, if I can just, because I was going through the same at a pastoral level of getting getting resigned in my own way from a pastoral position. And I think it's directly related to what we ended up doing, because as we were processing our own hurt and frustration over it, one thing very practically became clear is just recognizing the disconnect of, wait, we're just talking about the things that we learned in our education. These are things that our professors taught us about what the Bible is. It was our interest in the Bible. It was our curiosity about the Bible that is now leading to conclusions that are no longer welcome in these institutions. And this the disconnect of where is this scholarship for everyday people of faith? This seems to be pretty basic. If you get into the academic circles, this is old hat. This is not debatable stuff anymore. But you say it in a pew or from a pulpit or from a lectern at a different school with a different tradition, and all of a sudden the whole house is burning down. And it was this disconnect of, why is it that what we learned is getting stopped somehow? It's not making its way to everyday people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to move to the scholarship for everyday people in a moment. But before we go there, let me ask one follow-up for both of you then on this experience that you had. And that would be, we live at a time in which there are lots of folks in institutional context where all of a sudden they might feel no longer at home because of how rapidly things are changing in American culture. And that being the case, given your experiences, what would you say are things that you learned about being in a time of transition like that, where you're trying to sort through how do I speak up, push back, speak my mind when I know this might really cause a lot of problems? What did you learn about that process, and what did you kind of take away as practical wisdom in that regard?
Well, I think for myself, it was about learning to have the integrity to speak your mind, but trying to speak your mind well in ways that could still potentially build some bridges between people. But that's hard to do when, one thing Jared and I will both share is that there was an income involved, right? And this is the problem where, you've been teaching someplace for a while, and all of a sudden you're on the outside looking in. The goalposts have shifted, and you're no longer on the playing field. And that's a factor that comes into play for everything that you were alluding to. All these stories of people losing jobs at institutions, or, they were educated someplace really good, and then you come back, but you haven't changed, have you? We just want you in our catalog with this degree and stuff like that. So it's a complicated matter, but yeah, I don't know, Jared, what do you think?
Mine is very practical. I had a couple of guiding principles through times of transition, especially related to timing. I think the most helpful thing that I kept, it was almost a mantra on a week-to-week basis as things were getting progressively more and more untenable. And that is, am I becoming a better person or am I becoming a worse person? And I felt intuitively there would be a time in which me staying would mean I would have to start giving up on my own integrity. I would start being really stressed out and anxious and becoming a less present dad. And I would just become, there is a level of adversity and trial in that can really refine you and help you become a better person. And then there is a turning point I've experienced where I'm not actually becoming a better person. I'm becoming resentful and bitter and anxious and stressed, and I'm becoming a worse person. And so I just kind of kept telling myself almost on a daily basis, is today the day? Is there more for me to learn? Am I growing more humble? Am I trying to understand where I'm coming from? Am I getting perspective of the whole? Or am I just becoming bitter and resentful? And so once that switch flipped, I knew it was time for me to go. And so that was a really helpful principle in the midst of what could have been a very confusing time. And then the second one, which was much harder for me, was the recognition of how much energy I put into being well-liked and understood. And the painful process of recognizing there are some places in your life that you can't control, and you have to learn to let go of the need to have everyone like you, and you have to learn that you can survive being misunderstood, which is, I didn't think I could. I was fighting that fight till the bitter end, and then realized I survived, and that's been a very liberating feeling for sure.
That's well said, both of you. Thank you for that. So with regard to the venture that you've found your way into together, how would you summarize what you're seeking to do in the Bible for Normal People project?
Well, I'll mention one or two. There are many I think we could talk about, but one thing that really, I think, drove us to begin this, how many years ago?
8.
Just 8?
Yeah.
All right.
It felt longer, obviously.
Well, we wrote Genesis for Normal People 12 years ago.
Yeah.
So that was
we
the
started
Genesis.
Collaborating at least 12 years ago.
Yeah, correct.
Right? And one thing that, and this is Jared's language, to build institutions that don't exist yet, to do things that institutions don't do, such as talking openly about things that people talk about without fear of retribution. And so that, another way of putting that is creating safe space for people. And we've always wanted to build a community, and we have it. You know, we have a very active community at the Bible for Normal People. We have people on staff. It's not just Jared and me. And I was terrified of just being a lone ranger the rest of my life. I want to be part of a community, and that's much bigger than myself. And so I think that's what we're trying to do, and to bring the breadth of scholarly thinking on the Bible to people who are at that place where they're saying, you know, I keep hearing this stuff in church or on TV or whatever. It's like, it just doesn't make sense to me. Oh, well, I guess I'll throw the whole thing out. It's like, hold on, just put the brakes on, pump them a little bit here. So there are people who've been thinking about this stuff for literally 2,000 years and more. And a lot of thought has happened. And in the modern period, we've had to deal with things like science or archaeology, things that people haven't had to deal with. All that stuff is raising to the surface questions about the text that challenge our paradigms, that challenge how our inherited faith. And our approach is, we need to talk about that. That's it. We just, and we're not telling people what to think, but just, we need to think about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the summary, the questions that drive us, that maybe summarize that, is we're constantly asking the questions, what is the Bible and what do we do with it? And those are really the two questions that drive everything that we do. Because like Pete said, this tradition goes much deeper than a lot of us would have thought growing up, where it's almost seems like there was one way to do it and it's always been done the same way, and there isn't a lot of variation. And to see the breadth and the depth of the Christian tradition and how generations and generations have handled the text in different ways, and how scholars today are handling the text in different ways with really astute and scholarly insights into these things that for a lot of people, I think, is scary to step into. But once they do, it can be very motivating to see there are people who not only have asked these questions, but have answered them, maybe not with certainty, but with a way that catalyzes their faith, that actually deepens their faith, is mind-blowing for a lot of people who were like, no, if you ask this question, you are no longer a person of faith, and you are now kicked out of this community.
So let's talk about maybe some areas where you're doing this kind of work. So talk to me about, say, contemporary science and ways you see the need for honest, open conversations that perhaps are not allowed in given places, and how you facilitate that.
Well, we try to, and I think we do a pretty good job, although not everyone's in love with us for doing this. But, you know, the question of, you know, cosmology and biological evolution, these are things that from a scientific or anthropological point of view they don't fit with the biblical model. And the Bible has its own model, creation in 6 days, and then Adam out of the dust and the woman taken from his side. And that's how creation is. And those are stories that are just potent theologically and helps us understand what the ancient writers how they believed and why they believed what they believed. And in that sense, just from a historical point of view, I find it very fascinating. But of course, the problem is that, well, if the Bible says this, and science says this, how can you talk to each other? And that question, which is so much, has been on the forefront of people's minds, arguably since Copernicus, and Galileo, and since the telescope, and since we saw, the solar system is a little bit different than we thought it was. These questions have been on people's minds, and they're not going away. And with quantum physics and other sciences and neuroscience, the questions keep getting bigger. And I think our universe is getting bigger. And the Bible has a smaller universe in that sense, literally a smaller universe. So the question is, how can we, the age-old question of Christian and Jewish faith, how can we stay tied to the tradition while at the same time recognizing we're dealing with things that the authors of that tradition never envisioned? How can we have the conversation? And that is a conversation. That's not a matter of laying down dictates. It's a matter of thinking together and reasoning and trying to understand. And that is very threatening for some people. We're trying to make that a little less threatening because we think it's one of those vital questions that we have that Jared said, what is the Bible? Well, it's not a science book. And it's not, and in many respects, it's not really a history book the way we think of history. Why do you say that? Well, because the human drama has gotten to a point where we've experienced certain things, and it looks like, Genesis looks like some stories we see from other parts of the world in antiquity that we wouldn't call that history, so why call this history? We wouldn't call that science, why call this science? That is a very threatening idea for people, and I absolutely, we both get it. We both have people in our lives, we understand why that's threatening. But the fact that it's threatening doesn't mean it's wrong. It's just threatening. And the question is, how do we talk about that threat? And that is, where the community that we've built is very vibrant and talking about those kinds of things amongst themselves in a safe space, because they can't always do that in their churches or in their synagogues. It's not always possible for them to do that. So I think it's, as one theologian puts it, what we need is a third millennium theology. We need a theology that can address where we are now and where things are going. And rather than that being a threat to faith, that is what faith is. It's engaging your world with a tradition. And our tradition happens to be the Christian tradition. And there is an awful lot, as Jared was saying before, 2,000 years of interpretation. There's an awful lot there to draw on. I mean, one quick example is St. Augustine, who lived around 400, talking about Genesis chapter 1, and I'm paraphrasing him, but he basically says, you got to be crazy to think this is literal. And if you think that, just don't talk in public because you're making the rest of us look bad, right? That's essentially what he says. And that's part of the Christian tradition, is to talk like that. And to think that Christians have never thought about the biblical story and the world in which they themselves live and the tensions between them, that's what drives Christian theology. It's trying to make those things work. And we're just doing it in a very acute way, I think, with some of the challenges that are before us today scientifically and historically.
Jared, any commentary on that?
I think the only thing I would say is, I think for some reason, when you talked about that, the theologian, that we need a third millennium theology, I think what we're trying to do at the Bible for Normal People is actually a small slice of that, which is also a third millennium approach to the text, to the Bible, because, we have some friends and colleagues in more what we say mainline Protestant denominations, and they've kind of pretty much, they're good with the we need a new theology. And then you sort of say, okay, but what do you do with the Bible? And they're like, oh, I don't know. We don't really do anything with that because we don't really know what to do. That was back then, and we know how to theologize now, but we don't really know how these two things tie. And I think we're both, and maybe I don't want to speak for you, but I think we're both getting more and more passionate about helping people see what it means to have a Bible that is part of a tradition and to see that the Bible itself models it, and to see that it is a continuous tradition and development through these centuries.
An evolving tradition,
It's an evolving tradition. And I think because of our exposure to the Jewish tradition through, academic settings and otherwise, we see that this is possible. I mean, our Jews just tend to, at least in a scholarly and I think probably in a very practical, cultural way, just do this better than at least the Christian traditions that I've been a part of. That they understood the assignment and they have done it a little bit more explicitly than, for me growing up, the idea of tradition was anathema. Well, we don't have a tradition. That traditional, that's not only not biblical, but it's actually in my charismatic, which would have been more emotion-based tradition. Tradition would have been seen as limiting God and what God can do now. And in my more Calvinistic tradition, that Pete was talking about, tradition was a way to skirt around what the Bible clearly says. And so we just didn't have a room for this idea of tradition. And now what we're trying to tell our friends who are in these traditions is like, that's hurting you. Like, that's actually making this very difficult. And so we get blamed a lot for causing people to leave the faith. And we're like, actually, we're trying to scoop them up after they left because you told them it had to be this way.
Right.
And that way just doesn't make sense to them anymore. And we're trying to say, no, you're not alone. Look at all of these ways that people have been Christian as it relates to the Bible over the centuries. Pretty sure you're going to find a home here if you want it.
It seemed to me, going back to the notion of how you're trying to find a way to appropriate, respect, appreciate contemporary scientific findings, for example, and scripture of the Bible, that fundamentalists and secularists might say exactly the same thing to you.
Yeah.
Right? Is that they're both saying you've got to choose one or the other. You can't have some sort of serious engagement with both.
Right.
And they're just choosing different
Absolutes in a
disciplines.
way. Yeah, right.
Right. But how would you respond to them?
I think that this doesn't describe all atheists. There are atheists who don't think this way at all. But what you're describing, I'd say both sides are sort of metaphysically challenged. They're like the Bible is only one thing. And if it's the word of God, it's going to be flatly true about history and science and everything else. It's clearly not throw the whole thing out. And fundamentalists, the response to that is, oh, no, we have to double down on the fact that the Bible's right and it can be defended. And that's the whole apologetics industry that is involved in making that happen. And I would say two things to respond to that. Just read the Bible and pay close attention. Actually, don't even pay that close attention. See how different authors say different things about God, even to the point of being contradictory. See how they have different authors who have different takes on the very same event. I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, you have the story of the monarchy, which begins in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. A few hundred years later, another book was written called Book of Chronicles, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles in Christian Bibles, which has a very different take on the monarchy. And they're both part of Scripture, which means this text, I think, is designed by the people who compiled it to be a point of conversation and a point of saying, we're watching these people work out their faith in their own differing contexts. Maybe we do the same thing. There's biblical precedent, and also just the entire history of Christianity, for heaven's sake, is about trying to make sense of this text in sometimes very creative ways in order to make sense of their present reality. It wasn't so much looking backwards and recreating the old days. It's drawing that into the present moment. And to me, that's the best expression of Christianity. That's my bias. I like when I see that in the history of the church. And that's how I would respond to people who who have a very limited view, I think, of the Bible. I think a very limited view of what they mean when they say God. And that's a presupposition that just sort of gets dumped into this conversation, and people have responses to that. And given their way of thinking, I understand that, right? The point is like, just expand that thinking a little bit, and not in a weird way, just really looking at history.
Jared?
I was trying to sketch out too, there's something to be said for a historical understanding of this as well. And so if you go back to the modernist controversies in America in the 20s, where there is when science and these things start to impinge, Darwin, evolution, and these things start to come out, you do have a fairly large portion of clergy and academics starting to theologize in a way that's trying to make sense of it in their own way. And that's liberal Protestantism starts to take up some space and make headway, and that starts to become the norm in American Christianity. And then you have a reaction to that, which becomes fundamentalism. And so it's a way to react to this trying to make sense of these scientific discovery. Like, how do we do this? It's a stopping of that evolution and tradition development. And then I think of kind of modern atheists, and I don't mean people who don't believe in God in some way. I mean, this is maybe a crass way of saying it, but like atheism as a personality, where it's sort of like, they're very anti the Bible. It's sort of still, there's a gravitational pull. They're just reacting to it. That seems to be a reaction to the reaction to this liberalism. And so we kind of have this, it's a derivative notion that they're reacting to of, well, let me show you that the Bible isn't perfect. It's like, okay, but there's only a small swath of people who are inerrantists is the word, right? The idea that the Bible is inerrant and speaks only factual history and science and gives us everything we need morally, ethically, all of that packaged into one book with no error. That's a small swath that you're reacting to. And somehow it comes out as though you have dismissed and utterly rebutted all of Christian tradition. And so I think there's something too to having some perspective on how the historical developments of this comes about too.
Yeah. One of the things I hear you saying is that we must take account of our contemporary context in appropriating the tradition, the Bible in our own context. And I can imagine a critic coming back and saying, you're just bringing all sorts of subjectivity into this when there ought to be some sort of objective truth. And that you're just reading your vision of what you think Jesus ought to be and trying to impose that on all the rest of us. Surely you get that kind of critique. So what do you say to that?
Well, we're not trying to impose anything on anybody, but I think it is true that, see, one of the little secrets is that it's all subjective, right? There is no objectivity in a sense that I can lay hold of something. Even if you think the Bible is objective truth, I'm still as a subjective person interpreting it and trying to understand it in my humanity, in my socio-cultural setting, in my place and time, my gender, the color of my skin, all those things come into play in how we read this stuff. So subjectivity is unavoidable. And so, looking at, for example, the medieval period in Christianity, what's beautiful there is that they had all sorts of ways of going at this text and different things they got out of it, right? Because the text is not the rule book that tells you what to think. It's more the launching pad to considering God more deeply, and it gives you the language to do it. And sometimes it's by interrogating the text that you come to see a vision of God that's different. Is that subjective? Yeah, of course it is. What in our reality isn't subjective? I mean, maybe math. I mean, other things. But I mean, I'm not saying there's no such thing as objectivity. I'm just saying that we're talking about God here, right? And by definition, we're out of our element. And to say that I objectively have a handle on the creator of the multiverse is, to me, it's absurd. And the humility and the curiosity that I think that is needed to, embrace your subjectivity and to understand the world and yourself, and in the meantime, try to be a good person while you're doing it. Don't be vindictive. Don't be argumentative. Just, this is how I see things. This is how I commune with God. Oh, that's different than what I do. That's great. Tell me about it, right? I think that's very much needed in our culture today. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, maybe a simpler way of saying it is, we all do it. I don't think it takes much. It doesn't take much in conversation usually to go down the road, because usually when people say, that's what it goes hand in hand with taking the Bible literally. That's what they'll say. Take the Bible literally. And that means we're not putting our own stuff into it. But it doesn't take long to sort of say, well, why don't you apply this literally? Why don't you apply this literally? Why don't you enact this thing that seems clear that you're supposed to do, whether it's, certain mixed fabrics or whatever those things happen to be in the Hebrew Bible instruction. And then, even in the New Testament, following Jesus's words carefully. So it's very clear. It becomes quickly clear that we all pick and choose. The question only becomes, what's the framework that we're using to pick and choose? And that scares people because, again, what it's doing is it's rocking people's foundations around what the Bible can do for us. And I think for a lot of people, they grew up being told that the Bible is the rock solid foundation on which they can find certainty. And that's an important word, I think, in the work that we do. Pete wrote a book called The Sin of Certainty. So, and that's what people are looking for the Bible to do in a lot of cases, is provide certainty. So usually when someone says, you can't be subjective, we have to be objective, it comes from a need or desire or a teaching that the Bible gives us certainty. And then we just have to go down that path and ask, what do you mean by that? And again, once we go down that path a little while, we see the Bible is not a book set up to give us certainty. Mm-hmm. It's not up to the task. And that doesn't make the Bible flawed. It makes our expectations of the Bible flawed. Mm-hmm. And I would just agree. We all pick and choose. The history of the Christian tradition is how to pick and choose better, and how to have a framework for it so that there's some consistency or some logic to it, so it doesn't feel arbitrary to our own whims or easily co-opted by power, but can be useful in a community toward a more theological enterprise or an ethical enterprise of bearing witness to Christ in our communities and in how we go about our lives.
So I want to talk about certainty, but before we do that, let me ask a question about what appears to be an increase in anti-science thinking among some Christian circles. What are you seeing there? What frustrates you, concerns you? What are possible antidotes to that? Well,
if I could answer all those questions, I'd be a rich man, I think. Those are big questions. I mean, in my opinion, it's probably, I guess, I don't know, Jared, what do you think? Maybe last 20, 30 years, it's sort of become more prominent, and I think it's part of the cultural backlash in America against anything, I shouldn't put it that way, against things that are seen as a threat to the American way of life, which in our country is baked into that is a Christian identity. And again, going back to how for centuries now, America has had that Christian background where the Bible is very important, particularly the Bible taken literally is very important. And I think a lot of this is just, we're tired of scientists telling us that the Bible's not true. We're tired of these scholars telling us the Bible is not true. What we're actually saying is not that it's not true. It's not true the way you think that it is, but maybe it's true differently than you think that it is. And it doesn't operate as a history book or a science book. But that gets lost in the shuffle, oftentimes because of polemics, because it's debated and not just talked about together. But I think that is maybe, in my opinion, the root of it. And I don't know how, honestly, to get around that in terms of a program. What we try to do is, again, create safe spaces for people who are already wanting to be a part of that conversation, but feel like they can't because of where they're located. So that's a part that we're trying to do, is just say, listen, just if you want to talk, come on over here. There's a lot of stuff going on here. You might find it interesting and it's not going to collapse your life. Even though it's a big change for people. But people, I think, I'm very committed to this idea. I think people have to be ready to want that kind of a conversation. You can't force it upon them. And I think what people are reacting to is, to caricature ivory tower academics or scholars imposing it on people when they're not prepared to hear it. And I think pedagogically, that's not a good idea.
Well, and relationally and otherwise, you said you wanted to talk about certainty later, but I don't know if you can really talk about this without talking about certainty, because I don't think people are anti-science. They are anti having their feelings of certainty threatened. And it's powerful. It's a powerful drug. And I think we all want it. I think, we've had this conversation so many times with people in our community who are like longing for the days when they felt certain about things. Like, I didn't wish this upon myself. I didn't wake up one day and say, I'd love to have my foundation of certainty,
Can't wait
my
for that
place in the world, what I know to be true, shaken to its core. That would be great. But yet here we are. And so I agree. I think it's very hard to penetrate that for people. If people feel that they have this certainty, and to be honest, I think there's a psychological dimension of defensiveness where you kind of know it's a little precarious, so you're even more threatened by it if somebody starts poking holes in it. Right. People who really are certain or secure don't usually get that defensive and on the attack when you start poking at it. Mm-hmm. But that's for a different conversation. I just think I don't think people are anti-science. I think people will take science when it helps them, technology and health and these things, and I think they will only resist it when it threatens their sense of certainty.
And I think, can I add something to that, Lee? You remind me of something, a conversation I had with a friend a long time ago. Talk about, well, why do people react? The same question you just asked, why do they react? And I said, I think they're just afraid. Mm-hmm. And he said, he thought about it, and he said, I think what they're afraid of is that they will lose the sense of certainty of knowing what will happen to them after they die. And at first I said, that sounds too specific, but I thought about it over the years. I think there's a lot of truth to that, because when you have a system of thought that is the foundation of which is a sacred text that you believe is certain, and part of what this text tells you is that in this life or the next, God will never leave you. And there is a place for you. Death is not the end. Now, I happen to think death is not the end, but the point is that if that's your system, and it's rooted in an inerrant text that makes no mistakes, when you start poking holes in some of these stories, like the Genesis stories or the Exodus or something like that, it's logically, well, the whole thing's going to fall apart, and I'm losing my sense of certainty. I think another way of putting this, I think what's being addressed here is the deep existential fear of the fact that we're going to die. And the Bible gives us an answer to what happens. If you believe, blah, 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 you can't question anything. You just have to believe, and then you're safe.
Mm-hmm. So you go pretty strong in the title of your book, The Sin of Certainty. So you want to unpack why you would come out swinging at it that hard?
It helps to have books that have somewhat electric titles. I think you would agree. But I actually explain what I mean by that in the opening pages. Feeling certain about something isn't a sin. I think when you say it has to be certain and then you impose that on other people, I think that's the sin. Sometimes people aren't sure, and to tell them you're not really Christian because you have doubts, that's the kind of question I wrote that book about. And so you point to the Psalms where people are struggling spiritually all over the place. There's that you're not sure what God is up to. Now, God, you did this in the past. Why don't you do this again? You said you do this, you do something completely the opposite. People have doubts in the Bible, and that's part of the tradition as well. And it's inevitable. And doubting is, as many people have said, it's not the opposite of faith. Certainty is the opposite of faith. Doubt goes hand in hand with faith. That's part of the deal. And so in that sense, denying all that and making people's lives miserable, that's the sin. It's not when people think, I'm sure Jesus died for me. That's great. Okay, I'm not saying that's a sin. It's when people tell you, if you're ever not sure about that, then God has abandoned you. That's manipulation. That's coercion. And I think that's not true.
Well, and we just to point out, even in this conversation, and I like to point this out, we use the word feeling certain. Certainty is a feeling. And I think that's important to say because I've felt certain about many things in my life and it turned out to be untrue. And so what do we mean by certainty? I think is important in that conversation. Because I think people give it this status that if you think about how we use the word, it's a feeling and we can be wrong about that feeling. And sometimes it's pitted against feeling, right? Well, no, right. You need to ignore your feelings and be certain. It's like, well, certainty itself is a feeling. And so we need to figure out a better way of talking about these, like Pete says, in a way that doesn't shame and guilt people for that feeling or for not having that feeling.
Mm-hmm. And like certainty is not in the realm of logic and feelings get in the way. It's
right.
Like neuroscientists tell us,
it's all part of the same soup.
We're feeling people that think. We're not thinking people that happen to have feelings. So even that quest for certainty, the arguments we mount for certainty are rooted in our emotional lives. And I know that really is going to sound anathema to some people, just as a horrible thing to say. I think it's true. I've never had a thought where I didn't have a feeling that was driving it in some sense.
I cannot not think about a key moment for myself in seminary when I remember, being in a season of grappling with various questions of scholarship and science and so forth. I wondered what I was supposed to do with this refrain I used to get in my kind of fundamentalist church in Alabama growing up. And it was where the preacher used to say, you got to know, you know it's right. Mm-hmm. And he would just say that over and over again. And then finally one day I'm struggling with this and I finally say out loud, in this kind of meditative moment, I don't know I know any damn thing. and so it was just a huge turning point because then I had to decide, okay, what do I do on the other side of that, right? And what I hear you saying is you want to make space for people who realize that's not a way forward.
And part of that is also bringing God into the picture here. If we don't think of God as retributional or vindictive out to get us, that if we get a wrong answer on the theology exam, God's going to zap us. What if God respects the journeys that we all have to take? Like Jared said before, we didn't get up one morning and say, yeah, let's undermine something and make people's lives miserable. We're trying to act out of our own humanity and out of our own integrity. And if God exists, I think God has to understand that we're human beings. And, I can't help that I was born in a scientific age. Maybe it would have been easier 1,000 years ago, but here I am. Right. And the God thing has to engage our reality. And I know many people like this. I teach at a Christian college. Young people, they don't want anything to do with some of this stuff anymore because those models of faith, they don't address their reality. They don't address what they experience every single day. They're told, no, don't look at that stuff. Go over there. be under glass and everything's going to be okay. I really think, if I can make a subjective claim, I really do think that God honors our integrity. I think God honors more the person who, let's say, was raised in a Christian home and thinks to himself, I just can't. I have difficulty believing this, and here are the reasons why. And that person acts with integrity rather than people who just stay there out of fear. And they just stay on the beach blanket. They don't color outside the lines because they're just afraid, and they go on playing the church game the rest of their lives. And I think ultimately they're both fine. But the thing is, one is living their life
without fear,
without fear of God zapping them, and others are living in fear. And I refuse to believe that God is about making thousands of years of people on this pale blue dot that we live on afraid. I think we're the authors of our own fear, not God. And there are many strands of Christianity that have understood that since the very beginning. I would say the New Testament as well. And that's, to me, that's worth really on a top of a hill, just yelling it out there for people that there are other ways of thinking about God, not just the Bible, because that's really what it comes down to. It's the way you think about God influences how you think about the Bible and how you think about everything else. And that has to change as well.
Well, and with that, if I can just add that you talked about God being okay with us being human. And I think the idea of certainty within a faith context and its cousin, the idea of inerrancy, that we have a perfect Bible that gives us that certainty, is, I think, humans being uncomfortable with us being humans. It is saying, oh my gosh, isn't it scary to be a fragile, non-inerrant, imperfect human being who's trying their best? And then we have this product that sort of says, here, you can escape that. You just have to say this prayer and now you will be certain. And you just have to read this book that gives you everything you need because it doesn't lie and it tells you all the truth about history and science and ethics and the afterlife. And you can have that. And it's like, what a promise, but it's a false hope. It's an empty promise that leaves people often feeling fraudulent. Like it doesn't deliver. At the end of it, I do all of that. And then I'm told, and this is where I get a little riled up, I'm told in churches and by people in power that it's my fault that doesn't work. The magic pill didn't take, and that's my fault because the Bible's inerrant. It's perfect. All you need to do is trust it more. And it's like, I'm trying. And now there's all these products that come out and services and all of these ways that we help you get to that point that for me feels like from the beginning it's doomed to fail because what you're asking me to do is be superhuman. I can only be human. But it really does sell to get this. And the irony is that people who walk through these processes of an expansive faith end up having less fear, like Pete was saying, than the people who stay in it, even though what they're told and what they're sold is a way to get rid of the fear. And they end up with more of it. And I get frustrated about that, as you can tell.
Yeah. So let me push into that a little bit more. So to this point in the conversation, I've heard you say, we didn't go looking to raise these questions. They came out of our own experience as human beings, asking questions, reading the Bible, and the Bible itself raises a lot of these questions by just taking the Bible seriously. And that in turn leads to, as you talk about those things, that leads to other people feeling like they can raise these questions. But then you get what you just pointed to, Jared. I think your language was of people of power saying, you're the problem. It's your education, it's your question raising, it's your raising doubt. So you've already kind of indicated to us how you would...
sin, by the way, Lee. It's sin. You have a secret sin in your life, and you're using all of your scholarship and all your thinking and all your questions to justify a sinful life. So go on.
Wow. Yeah, well, that's quite a different charge.
It gets pretty dark.
So how do you process that? I mean, surely that raises a bit of anger, frustration.
Can I go first?
Yeah,
I think
ahead.
it actually, for me, early on, I was very, very sad.
Huh.
Because again, what a slap in the face to spend your life so passionate and dedicated to this thing that you go to school for it, go undergrad, graduate school, seminary, you spend your life dedicated to it, your career, you're a pastor, you teach, and then to be told over and over by people you love and care about that you're sinful and you're doing this because you're running away from God and you're doing it to justify sin and all these nefarious motives that get put on you. It was heartbreaking to go through that experience and to say my earnestness and sincerity in all of this being questioned and being revoked, and now friends are being lost and relationships are being severed, and I genuinely don't understand what's happening. So that, the feeling, that deep feeling of being misunderstood, can be very isolating and can be really sad. And, I was grateful to have a Pete and a couple of other people in my life where we could kind of like say, you too? Like, well, I trust you. Like, you're a smart man. You're like, you've gone through a lot. And luckily there were people in my life because that can be a real, I was going to use a very inappropriate phrase, but it can be very tough for you mentally to not think like, maybe I am the problem, because all these people I love and care about in my life are telling me I'm the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really hard not to take that on, especially, and I a lot of women that I know and in community have been taught, kind of conditioned in their tradition, not to trust their own feelings and not to trust their own intuitions anyway. And so then that gets doubled down on, and that could be a very tumultuous time to basically double down on this self-hatred that a lot of people experience. So I wish actually, especially women, would be more angry about it. But for me, it was more sad than angry.
Yeah, and I think Jared and I have slightly different, I think dramatically different family backgrounds, because I didn't have, if I can say, the baggage that Jared had. My parents were Europeans, and it was like...
You had your own baggage.
Yeah, but I definitely have baggage, German baggage. I think my OCD comes from being German. But, just my parents were like, the attitude was like, we believe in God, just don't let it get out of hand. Just don't be crazy. But for me, it's, Jared too, but I've had some pretty horrible things said about me publicly. Really, social media, this whole thing. So, and it doesn't get me sad or mad. It's just, why? Why is this even going on? And sometimes people say, I can't wait for you to go to hell and to watch you burn. I've gotten that quite a few times. And I try to respond like, so what you're saying is you disagree with me, right? But that's really what it is, So I think about, and I hope this comes across, I don't mean this is in a sort of a condescending way, but like, who hurt you to talk like that about a spiritual life to somebody you've never met? And just because they say, I think evolution's true, here's how I reconcile it with the Christian faith, they pronounce with a smile on their face that you're going to burn forever, tortured because of this thought, right? I really do think there pity does come into my mind in terms of how I think about people. Sometimes they just annoy me, but if I take a step back, I say, what kind of a life do they have? What kind of a parent are they? What kind of a sibling are they? And just and is that what the Christian faith produces? Well, in some people it does. I don't think it's right, and I think it's actually not biblical, as they say. I think the biblical stories, I wouldn't support that kind of a way of thinking about God, but still.
What would you say constructively has come to you through these various experiences of marginalization?
Repeat. Say that question differently. I'm not sure what you're getting at.
So if you have had these experiences where you're being under the lash of public judgment, social judgment, shame, wishing that you'd go burn in hell, losing a job, loss of security from social connections, all these things. You pointed to kind of some of the painful emotions or difficulties of that. And so my question is, what kind of virtues or constructive things have happened in your life because of these difficulties?
Oh, yeah. In no particular order, I'd say one is not feeling like I have to be right when I engage other people. Because when they do that to me, I don't appreciate it. So I try to couch things in ways like, this is how I put the pieces together. Here are some factors. Here's how I corral them and make some sense of them. And if that works for you, that's great. If not, I'm happy to hear it. So that's one part. I think it's brought me to let go of the need to be certain, right? And to express that certainty to other people. There's some things I am certain about. Like I'm certain that other way of thinking isn't really Christian. I hope you burn in hell for eternity because I disagree with you, right? But most things, I don't know. I truly don't know. I mean, do you know God exists? Well, not in the way that you're talking about knowing. It's not like that. Do you know that you're right about the Bible? No, I don't know that I'm right. But here's how I, in my journey, am putting these pieces together. And it's not for lack of thought. It's not for lack of being put through the ringer for all these years in school and things like that. But I don't think the way I thought in school. Life has happened, right? So I've put the pieces together, and here's how I do it. And if this helps you, that's great. I'm very, very happy for that. And if it doesn't, that's okay. You can still be a good person and not try to malign others because you disagree with them. And I encounter all that in the public sphere and social media. There are very reasonable people who disagree, but we don't hate each other over it. See, and to me, that's just it. And Jared alluded to something earlier. I think a Jewish mindset that has done a better job of this than Christians traditionally. And I think that's, on the whole, probably true, because built into the Jewish experience with the Mishnah and then the Talmud and Jewish commentaries on Scripture, it's very dialogical. And you have Rabbi so-and-so disagreeing with Rabbi so-and-so who disagrees with Rabbi so-and-so about Genesis 1:1, and then they just move on to the next verse. Because the issue isn't about getting it, having the final word on what you're calling God's word. How can you have the final word on that if it comes from God? There has to be layers of meaning and depth to it. John Levinson, who is a Jewish scholar, who's one of my professors at Harvard, said, the difference between Jews and Christians when it comes to the Bible is that for Jews, the Bible is a problem that you get to try to solve somehow. For Christians, it's a message to be proclaimed. You don't have a lot of leeway. The Bible is a message, it's about Jesus and about your relation to Jesus and what happens to you when you die. If that's the message that people hear, there is very, very little room for dialogue or debate, because you have to hold on to that sense of certainty.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I've kept thinking about a line from Alistair McIntyre, the philosopher, who defines a tradition as an argument extended across time.
Yes.
And I find that super helpful, right? It's, are we trying to be a part of something that we just dispense all the answers,
right,
or are we actually interested in being a part of a long, extended argument about?
And the thing is, Lee, that's the Bible. That's the thing that frustrates me so much. That the Bible, that's why people talk about the biblical tradition, because it's doing that. It's over time. It was written over roughly 1,000, maybe 1,200 year period, if you include the Christian scriptures with that. You're going to have some differences of opinion. You're going to have developments in thought. And we see that. It's in front of us if we just take the time to look at it. That's always been the way. And do we stop that now? Have we? There are people who think that, well, my church pretty much has it right. and I'm not going to listen to anything. Okay, have fun. If we can't talk, we can't talk. But that's spread, and that's, I think it's gotten a bit out of hand actually in our country over the past few decades.
But to go back to what we were talking about much earlier about kind of the fundamentalists and the atheists, it's whenever I would just maybe say that there's a different paradigm too, that perhaps the point isn't to get to the answer, because I think that's what fundamentalists are like. We have the answer. And the atheists are like, look at the history, man. You've been disagreeing for 2,000 years. You don't have the answer. And so it's like, but they're still into this paradigm that the point is the answer. And I think what I appreciate about a dialogical tradition like Judaism and certain strands of Christianity is they realize that maybe the point's the process. Maybe the point is in the dialogue, that we're not trying to get to the answer, but that we find our hope anew in the conversation, that it is more like going to the gym rather than acing the test. Mm-hmm. And going to the gym requires you to go to the gym. You're not ever done. You're just continually working out for the sake of working out. And like the process is the thing that grows us, not the answer isn't what grows us. And maybe growth is the point. So I just think it's a different paradigm for how to approach the faith and the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So let me switch gears to humor. You guys are obviously reasonably funny.
Thank you.
Reasonably
Yeah.
funny.
All right,
Whatever
end,
that means.
We can end now.
Okay, yeah.
Well, I want to.
I want to be
hedge my
unreasonably
bets here.
funny, but go ahead.
I don't want you getting a big head, Pete.
Okay.
Too late.
You Harvard people.
Too late.
So you're reasonably funny, and I wonder, you've got, for example, your tagline for your podcast, the only God ordained podcast on the internet, and I do love your mean reviews video segments. Those are delightful. Yeah. And so there's obviously, a way in which humor goes a long way in engaging an audience. It's a great communication tool and all that kind of stuff. But I also wonder if there's something deeper here, in the sense that, well, let me pose it as a question rather than saying what I think. Is there a degree to which your humor is a classic case of the medium is the message?
I probably would want to think about that. I'm not conscious of that. I think I've always been. What I decided to do after I left my teaching position, I was trying to think, what do I want to do? And I decided I'm tired of not being who I am. And I've always been a joker and things like that. So it just sort of comes out naturally. I think it has the added benefit of maybe people seeing me as a person who likes to joke around and makes bad dad jokes in his books and things like that. But that's authentic for me. And it's a way of disarming what could be a very difficult conversation for people. I think it's a way of, I think people might listen to me more with what I have to say about things that are potentially threatening. So that's the way I'm very willing to see it. Maybe Jared, you have a very different perspective. That's how I see the role of humor in my speaking, my teaching, my writing. It's a way of helping people not be bored when I'm talking about things that might be boring, and to sort of weasel in and say, now I have you. Listen to what I'm saying. And that's a very serious thing that we're going to talk about now. And I have them maybe willing to listen a little bit better.
And maybe it's not an either or, maybe it's a both and, in that, I would agree. I think what we do works because it's authentic to who we are. It's just part of our personalities. But I think they're intertwined. And what I mean by that is, I think it's very helpful that we don't take ourselves that seriously in a world where that would be very easy to do. Academia, scholarship, look at us. We're very smart. We say smart and important things. Listen to us because we're going to give you all the answers. Like, that's not how it works. And so I think there is the medium is the message, in that I think it's very refreshing for people to hear the Bible being talked about in a way that doesn't take the subject matter or the speakers as seriously. It's like, yeah, this is important, but even important things you can joke about.
Right.
And
not take yourself that seriously.
Yeah, I think it comes from a sense of we don't take ourselves that seriously. And that's where that helped me a lot in terms of the social media trolls, where it's sort of like for years, and you probably relate to this too. It's like somebody's wrong on the internet. Ugh, and it's like you get so angry about it. And it's like you gotta go correct this. And this is and just realizing like, why am I taking this so seriously? Oh my goodness. And it just makes life a lot better, I think, to not be so intense about that.
I came up, a thought entered my mind years ago, Lee. I was writing something and I said, theology is like a 3-year-old coming home from preschool with a crayon drawing and they show it to mom. And the mother says, oh, that's a beautiful, not willing to commit herself because she has no idea what's going on. That's a great boat. No, it's a house, mommy. Oh, it's a great house, right? I think of that's what I do. I draw those those little colored things, and it's like God's like, that's adorable, So I just when I think of the subject matter, I can't help but think, let's just be free of all that stuff. Let's just talk to each other and let's let our own personalities come out as we do that. And let's let this whole thing be, as pleasant a journey as possible. Sometimes it's difficult talking about religious things, but other times it can actually be fun to have an insight. Say, I never saw, man, that changes everything. I never saw that before, right?
Yeah.
And I think the less seriously we take ourselves, the more likely I think we can have moments like this. And, maybe the biblical word for this is humility. I think having a self-deprecating sense of humor, there's an aspect of humility to that where I'm willing to poke fun at myself because I know how limited I am in my understanding of everything. The more I know, the more limited I am. I know that I'm limited, but here's how I put the pieces together. Throwing a dad joke, what's the harm?
We've been talking to Pete Enns and Jared Byas of the Bible for Normal People Project and podcast. Pete, Jared, thanks so much for your time. It's great to be with you today.
Same to you.
Same here, man.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
From PRX.